This time in Hanging in My Tree, we're going to look at the sad story of George Rutherford Buchan, or Rud. Rud was my great-grand-uncle, the uncle of my grandmother. George was born in 1893 in Pyrmont, New South Wales, Australia. He was the 9th child of Reverend James Buchan and Christian Buchan, maiden name Jack. He had no children. I will do a separate episode about his father, the Reverend, who immigrated to Sydney from Aberdeenshire in Scotland, where coincidentally my husband has family now. The Reverend's wife, Christian, followed later with 5 children: Margaret or Maggie Munro, Elizabeth or Lizzie Duthie, Christian or Christine Isabel, Annie Jack, James or Jim Alexander. Rud's 3 other brothers, John, William or Bill, and Ernest Alexander, my great-grandfather, were all born in Pyrmont, where the Reverend had his Pyrmont Congregational Church. There is not a lot of information about George in his early years. We know that the family lived in Pyrmont, the Congregational Church being at 2 Allen Street, Pyrmont. The family lived in the manse of the church. We know from his army records that Rud was employed as a clerk, but we do not know where he was employed. When Rud was alive, Pyrmont was a very different place to what it is now, and the church the family lived in no longer stands. According to online sources, at the time that Rud lived, Pyrmont had industry and sandstone quarries. There was a stark contrast between the middle-class owners of the businesses and the poor who lived in the crowded terraces. Pyrmont was badly affected by the economic depression in 1890, with increased unemployment and evictions. The Pyrmont Bridge, the walking bridge that you now walk on in Darling Harbour, was built in 1902 to connect Sydney with the CSR factory in Pyrmont. In 1914, the population of Australia had almost reached 5 million. Electric lighting was replacing gas lamps, and motor cars competed with horse-drawn carts. The homes didn't have electricity, so coal and wood fires were used to cook meals, and ice chests were used as refrigerators. Outhouses or long-drop toilets were common. Also in 1914, the First World War, the Great War, had begun as a result of conflict between the Allies, which included Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Japan, USA, Australia and New Zealand, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey. The assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June 1914 caused a chain of events that led to a declaration of war on 4 August 1914, when German forces invaded Belgium. Great Britain was obliged to defend Belgium. Australia's involvement in World War I began when Britain went to war with Germany. From the beginning, the war propaganda pressured all men to do their duty to king and country. A little over a month after World War I started, on the 21st of September 1914, Rud joined the Australian Imperial Force 13th Battalion. His service number was 240. Rud joined the influx of volunteers in 1914, perhaps seeking adventure or because of patriotism. Here is his oath when enlisting. When Rud reported to a recruiting depot, a medical examination was arranged. In the early days of World War I, only the fittest were accepted into the forces, and in the first year of the war, almost a third of the volunteers were rejected on medical grounds. Rud was declared fit at Rosehill by the examining medical officer. We know that on enlistment, Rud was 21 years and 5 months of age, 5 feet 6 inches tall, 9 stone. His chest was 32 to 35 inches, and he had fair complexion, blue eyes and brown hair. The Australian Imperial Force 13th Battalion was raised from late September 1914. It, with the 14th and 16th Battalion, formed the 4th Brigade. The brigade reportedly left for overseas in late December after a brief stop in Albany, Western Australia. On 3 January 1915, Rud disembarked the ship HMT Tunisian in Alexandria, Egypt. The 13th Battalion trained in Egypt at the Zouitan training base near Cairo. Training included basic military operations, rifle skills and combat readiness. In Egypt, the 4th Brigade became part of the New Zealand and Australian Division to join the Gallipoli or Dardanelles campaign in Turkey. Whilst I do not have a copy of the postcard, on Ancestry.com there is a transcription of a postcard that Rud sent to his mother from Alexandria. According to the transcription, the postcard was sent on the 2nd of April 1915 and says, "Just to say, I was slightly hit by a piece of shrapnel, but will very likely be back in a week or 2 at the most. I have heard nothing about any of the ones I know, and I can't say how any of them are getting on. No more news from your loving son, Rutherford. On the 12th of April 1915, Rud proceeded to join the MEF, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. The MEF was under the control of General Sir Ian Hamilton and referred to as the Forces of Gallipoli. The Gallipoli Campaign and the ANZACS, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, are well known to Australians. The aim of the Gallipoli Campaign was to control Constantinople, or Istanbul, which would allow the Allied forces to send supplies to Russia. Despite initial success, the Allied forces faced challenges, including the harsh conditions, including steep cliffs with little natural cover, that meant the men were pinned down by enemy fire, the Ottoman defences as well. The Allied troops were forced to build trenches to protect themselves, and there was insufficient ammunition for the artillery units. The Allies lost a third of their men, and reinforcements were constantly being brought in. Conditions in the trenches were bad. The weather wavered between hot and cold, and endless wet weather flooded the trenches. The men had inadequate clothing, erratic food supplies, and nowhere to bury the dead. The Allied troops eventually withdrew due to the high number of casualties. The 4th Brigade landed in Anzac Cove late on the 25th of April 1915. During May to August, Rud's battalion was heavily involved in defending the front line. On 2 May 1915, Rud suffered a gunshot wound to his right thigh whilst on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The two weapons that caused the most casualties in World War I were artillery and machine guns. Shell fragments, shrapnel and blast concussion from artillery rounds accounted for 51% of battle casualties. Bullets from rifles, 34%. A wounded man had to survive the journey, often by stretcher bearers, through a battlefield with machine gun and artillery fire. They would be patched up and stabilised at regimental aid posts. On 2 May, Rud was transported on the hospital ship HMT Galinka with gunshot wound to his right thigh from the Gallipoli Peninsula to Alexandria. On 3 May, he was transferred from the hospital ship to HMT Gorka to Manchester, England. On 16 May 1915, he was admitted to the 2nd Western General Hospital in Manchester. He returned to the Australian New Zealand Army base camp from England and rejoined the MEF. On 21 May 1915, there is a report. G.R. Buchan, wounded, will advise upon further particulars. Imagine receiving that in Australia. On 24 June 1915, there is a letter from Reverend Buchan stating that he received a letter that Rud was in hospital in Manchester, England, and that further particulars would be coming to hand. He said, "I have to thank you most heartily and will be very grateful to receive further particulars as soon as they're available." On 31 July 1915, there's a letter to the Reverend advising that Rud had been reported to have embarked on 22 July 1915 to rejoin the troops at Dardanelles. On 3 August 1915, he boarded the ship HS Saturn to Alexandria to return to the front. On 10 August 1915, he embarked for duty on the transport Caswell Castle. 23 August 1915, he rejoined the 13th Battalion at the Gallipoli Peninsula. On 3 December 1915, he was promoted to Lance Corporal. On the HT Tunniston, he disembarked at Alexandria. On 5 March 1916, he was recorded at Tel El Kabir at the training centre for the Australian Imperial Force to be a corporal. On 1 June 1916, he went from Alexandria to join the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, which was the British main army on the Western Front. Rud disembarked at Marseille on the 8th of June 1916. The 13th Battalion took part in trench warfare in France at Béziers. On 21 July 1916, in the field in France, he was made a temporary sergeant. On 7 August 1916, in the fields of France, he was confirmed in rank and made a sergeant. On 13 August 1916, he was wounded in action again. In the fields of France, he had a gunshot wound to his back, spine and head. On 18 August 1916, he embarked on the hospital ship Mahano for England from Havre. On 19 August 1916, he was admitted to Lord Derby's War Hospital in Warrington, England. In 20 August 1916, a letter to the Reverend now reported that the Sergeant George R. Buchan was admitted to Lord Derby Hospital, Warrington, gunshot wound, back and head severe. 19 August will promptly advise if anything further is received. On 12 September 1916, a letter, George R. Buchan has been reported wounded on a second occasion, the nature of which and the hospital he has been admitted to is not known at present. It is not stated as being serious, and it is assumed that the wounds are progressing satisfactorily. On 13 June 1916, he was moved to the 1st Australian Auxiliary Hospital in Harfield House Hospital, Epsom. Following this gunshot to his head and back, he spent 87 days in hospital. The notes say, wounding shrapnel removed from scalp and back, result good. On 26 September 1916, a letter was sent from the base records to the Reverend that Rud was progressing favourably and that they would promptly advise if anything further was received. After a second major gunshot wound and after a long recuperation hospital, Rud was again returned to the battlefield. On 1 January 1917, he marched out to Pyrmont Downs from Wareham. He proceeded to France on the Princess Clementine. On 16 January 1917, he rejoined the battalion after being wounded. On 11 April 1917, he was missing in action in France. On 11 April 1917, previously reported wounded, killed in action, subject missing. Rud was dead and only 24 years of age. What I think makes his death even sadder is finding out the circumstances of his death. According to the Australian War Memorial website, 4 experienced divisions of the ANZACS Corps were part of the British Fifth Army. The General wanted to attack Bullecourt to support an offence by the 3rd British Army to the north and the French Army to the south. The commander, Gough, was young and energetic, but his poor planning resulted in heavy losses. His attack launched at Bullecourt was a disaster. In this attack and on 3 May 1917, the AIF lost 10,000 men, one of whom was Rud. General Gough planned to use the 4th Australian Division and the 62nd British Division to attack the Hindenburg Line near the village of Bullecourt. Rather than wait for sufficient artillery resources, he employed a dozen tanks to lead the troops through the enemy's barbed wire. The attack was set for the 10th of April 1917, but did not proceed because the tanks did not arrive. It went ahead the following day with disastrous results. The men were exposed to machine gun and artillery fire, and the Australians were forced back to their own lines, while the tanks stood burning in the battlefields. The Australians had 3,000 men killed or wounded. Many of the survivors were bitter about such a futile waste. An official historian, Charles Bean, was reporting as saying, Bullecourt, more than any other battle, shook the confidence of the Australian soldiers in the capacity of the British command. The errors, especially on the 10th and 11th of April, were obvious to almost everyone. On 5 September 1917, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that Reverend James Buchan had a memorial service at the Pyrmont Congregational Church, as 5 members of the congregation had died and 2 were missing, including the Reverend's son, George Rutherford Buchan. Sadly, Rud was already killed in action by this stage, but the family were unaware. From 8 July 1917, Rud's mother, Christian Buchan, was granted a pension of 30 shillings per fortnight. On 8 October 1917, his records state that he was previously reported missing in action, now reported killed in action, in the field as part of the British Expeditionary Force. On 14 November 1917, there is a field service report to the War Office that Sergeant George Rutherford Buchan was killed in action, that his cause of death was in the proceedings of court of inquiry, and the particulars of his burial were not known. On the 27th of December 1917, the administrative headquarters of the AIF received a letter from the Red Cross of a statement received by Private Nathaniel Sutherland. The statement made by DVR Doyle, 13th Battalion. Re. Number 240, Sergeant Buchan, 13th Battalion, missing 11 April 1917. I last saw the above-mentioned Sergeant Buchan around 10 p.m. on 10 April 1917. On the night of the 11th of April, I was told by my present Sergeant, Major D. Coy of the 13th Battalion, whose name I do not remember, that Sergeant Buchan was wounded in the arms and shoulder and that he was missing. Statement made 16 September 1917 at Weymouth G.H. Doyle. On 28 June 1917, a letter was dispatched to Reverend J. Buchan at the Manse, Allen Street, Pyrmont, that the Graves unit had been unable to obtain a trace of the last resting place of Rud. On 18 April 1918, there is a letter to Curry and Wood solicitors enclosing a report of death and noting that they, the solicitors, hold the will of Rud. The report of death states that Rud was killed in action in France, 11 April 1917. On July 1921, the Reverend passed away. A page in Rud's military records shows that his father has passed and that his mother, Mrs. C. Buchan of Rutherford, Fleet Street, Carlton, was his next of kin. The house Rutherford was named in honour of Rud. On 25 July 1921, Rud's mother, Christian, received a memorial scroll and the King's message. On 7 February 1922, Rud's brother, William Buchan, wrote a letter to the military. With reference to the particulars herewith regarding my brother, number 240, Sergeant G.R. Buchan, dead, please note that the next of kin is now his mother, Mrs. C. Buchan, of the above address, his father, Reverend J. Buchan, having died recently. Also, I would be glad if you could inform me of whether any trace of my brother was found by the Graves unit, as no information to that effect was received by his relatives. On 15 February 1922, there is a letter from base records to William Buchan confirming that no bearer report has been received in respect of Rud, and in the absence of an official advice of registration, it must reluctantly be concluded that the Graves Registration Unit have not yet succeeded in locating his final resting place. Failing the discovery and identification of actual remains, it is the intention of the authorities to perpetuate the memory of these fallen by the erection of a collective memorial upon which full regimental descriptions of the soldier and date of death will be inscribed. On 20 September 1922, Rud was awarded the Victory Medal, the Star and the British War Medal, which were given to his mother. On 8 February 1923, his mother received a memorial plaque. Rud's sacrifice is remembered in a number of places. In the Roll of Honour, in the Australian War Memorial in ACT Canberra, Panel 68 in the commemorative area, Villers-Bretonneux Memorial, Brigade, France, Memorial ID 16180560, Pyrmont Ultimo War Memorial, the family grave plot, which has engraved, missing at Bullecourt, 11 April 1917. He was not, for God took him. Not only was the Reverend and Christian's home named Rutherford in honour of Rud, his brother James named his son James Rutherford Buchan. His sister Annie Jack named one of her sons George Rutherford Rhymes. The Buchans were not the only family affected by war. For a population of 5 million people, Australia had over 340,000 men enlisted. 60,000 of these were killed and 156,000 were wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. In Australia, those men are commemorated each year on ANZAC Day, the 25th of April. Should you have any further documents or information about Rud, please let me know. This video was created for families, so contains information from Ancestry.com, family documents, and also information obtained online. There are direct quotes from other sources.